So Genesis chapter 1, verses 24 to 28, that's our text. And we come here then to the events of the sixth day of creation week. And throughout Genesis 1, there have been lots of God saids. And here in these verses that we're looking at this evening, there are three of them. And we're going to structure our sermon then around those three God saids. We're going to focus on the different ways in which God speaks here. And notice with me, first of all, then, resourceful speech. Resourceful speech. So verse 24 begins, and God said, let the ... It signals that God is about to call something into existence. He's done that again and again, of course, in Genesis 1. And at times it's been quite remarkable. We focused a few weeks ago on him summoning light into existence there in verse 3. And the way in which he's calling for something at that point that isn't even a concept yet. That there isn't such a thing as light as he says, let there be light. And yet he calls for it, knowing exactly what it is that he intends and what it is that he wants. How does he do that? As I say, it's really quite remarkable. Well, here now in verse 24, he calls for land animals to come into existence. Remember, the creatures that are to populate the sea and the creatures that are to populate the sky, they've already been created on day 5 in verses 20 to 23. But these now are the creatures that will populate the land. And I want to show you that there's something about his calling for the land animals here that in its own way, albeit in a quite different way from when he calls for light, is also remarkable. You see, he calls for the animals to emerge in a very specific fashion. He calls for them to emerge from something else. And God said, let the earth bring forth living creatures. The animals then are to emerge from the earth. Now, that is a little bit similar to what we had back in verse 11. And God said, let the earth sprout vegetation, plants yielding seed, and fruit trees bearing fruit, in which is their seed. It's a little bit similar to that, except that there's something much more obvious, isn't there, about vegetation and plants and trees emerging from the earth. I mean, that didn't just happen then, on day 3 of the creation week. It still happens, doesn't it? Those things still emerge from the earth today. And so it's not difficult for us to imagine that day 3 scene, an area of empty, nondescript earth. And out of that earth pops up stalks and stems and shoots and so on. And okay, perhaps it happens here in an abnormally rapid manner, but you and I are familiar these days with time-lapse videos we've watched on YouTube, things sprouting up out of the ground very quickly, haven't we? And so, as I say, we can imagine what's going on there in verse 11. But this scene here in verse 24, it's not obvious like that other one. Here we have an area of empty, nondescript earth. And out of that earth pops up not stalks and stems and shoots, but animals. Of all things. That's an awful lot harder to imagine, isn't it? I mean, brown, squidgy, damp, pebbly earth just seems such unlikely raw material for animals. I feel like it would almost be less remarkable if God just created the animals out of nothing. Just let there be animals, and suddenly from nowhere they are there. I think in that case, I would just kind of go, yeah, okay, that's fair enough, that makes sense, and I would move on to the next bit of the account. But creating the animals out of the earth, what's that about? How do you get from that clumpy, unpromising earth to all these creatures that bark and snort and run and climb and all the rest of it? That's what I mean by resourceful speech. This simple command in verse 24 makes the larger-than-life animals that we all know so well and love so much emerge from lowly, unglamorous earth. And such a diversity of animals. Even in our most dopey moments, we would never confuse an elephant with a rabbit, would we? Or a squirrel with a baboon, or a polar bear with a meerkat, because they're all just so different. And I mention that because I suppose you or I might think, okay, I know God is resourceful, so perhaps he can find a way of turning raw bog into some animal. Let's say a beaver. Perhaps there's something about bog that's conducive to forming beavers, some intrinsic connection between the two things. We might be able to just about get our heads around a thought like that, but the idea that from the same raw bog, possessing the same properties, God could produce as well as a beaver a giraffe, and as well as a beaver and a giraffe an orangutan, well, that's crazy. How is bog bendable and adaptable to such an array of wildly different animals? I'm saying this is off the scale resourcefulness. And it's something actually which the Apostle Paul reflects on in a passage to which we referred very briefly last week and which I read from this evening, 1 Corinthians chapter 15. And I'm thinking now of verses 39 to 41 of that chapter. And Paul talks there about all these different kinds of flesh and all these different kind of bodies that God came up with at creation. It's this same point that I'm making just now. But why exactly is Paul reflecting on that in 1 Corinthians 15? Well, the answer is quite interesting. The theme of 1 Corinthians 15, as many of you will know, is the resurrection of the dead on the last day. Paul is basically addressing Corinthian objections to the idea of the resurrection of the dead. And one of the things the Corinthians were saying then is noted by Paul in verse 35 of that chapter. They were saying, how are the dead raised? With what kind of body do they come? You see, the Corinthians knew the basics of biology. They knew that if you were to go down to Corinth's cemetery and you were to excavate the graves there, you wouldn't find much, just dust. In every grave, dust. And their point then, when they asked, how are the dead raised? With what kind of body do they come? Their point was, well, how do you resurrect dust then, Paul? A freshly dead body maybe, but when there's hardly anything left of the body, for goodness sake, then what? Are those grains of dust in some grotesque way going to reassemble and start walking around in heaven? Is that what you're saying? Well, if that's going to happen, Paul, I think we'd rather go without resurrection, thank you very much. It's not exactly an attractive proposition. And those verses then about creation, verses 39 to 41 of 1 Corinthians 15, those are Paul's response to that objection. And he's saying to them, look, guys, when was our resourceful God ever restricted by his raw materials? Out of bland, lifeless earth, he once produced koalas and horses and camels and chimps. Out of the ground they came in all their magnificent array. And a day is coming when out of bland, lifeless dust, he will produce resurrection men and women. And as the graves are opened that day, out of the ground they will come in all their magnificent array. And so this evening, look back and celebrate the resourcefulness of our God in creation, but also look forward and anticipate the resourcefulness of our God in resurrection. When God is in creative mode, you see, he doesn't need anything special to work with. Bare earth was enough. Bare earth was enough. He worked with that, and he fashioned from it some pretty fine things on day 6 of creation week. And on the last day of history, your corpse will be enough. Your long dead, sad and sorry remains, they will be enough. And he will work with that corpse. And he will fashion from it something as stunning as the glorified body of Jesus Christ, his Son. What a God this is. What a sensationally resourceful God. Resourceful speech. Secondly, this evening, rapturous speech. Rapturous speech. Because as God then moves on and speaks again in verse 26, that, I suggest, is what it is. Rapturous speech. Rapturous is a strong word. According to my dictionary, it means, or rapture means, extreme delight. We talk, don't we, about rapturous applause. And rapturous applause, then, isn't a polite, embarrassed little ripple. It's long and deafening, an audience so thrilled with what it's just seen or heard that hands are clapped together with force and with vigor until the skin goes red and sore and stinging. And it's not merely my desire for alliteration in my headings that has driven me to the word rapturous here. In the last few weeks, I've spoken of gusto, haven't I? The gusto with which God creates everything during this week here in Genesis 1. But as we come now to verse 26, I'm deliberately reaching for a stronger term than that. Because what we have here in verse 26 is not just more of the same. God's emotional engagement unquestionably goes up a gear, and gusto turns now into out-and-out rapture. And what's the reason then for this emotional gear change? What brings on the divine rapture here halfway through day 6? Well, you know the answer. You know what takes place there in verse 26. What takes place in verse 26 is the creation of man. And as God turns then to the creation of man, he doesn't say, let there be man. He doesn't say, let the earth swarm with men. He doesn't say, let the earth bring forth man. Instead, the three divine persons seem at this point to look each other in the eye, as if this is the moment that they've been waiting for and that they've been building towards all through these 6 days. They're about to bring into being the crowning component of their whole creation project. My dear son and my beloved spirit, the Father says, are you ready for this? Let's do this thing. Let's take things now to a whole new level. Let's finally unveil our masterpiece. Let us make man. Perhaps indeed the rapture is so intense in the heart of God that it even causes him to burst into song. Certainly in verse 27 we have a song. We can't be sure whose song it is. Perhaps it's Moses' song. We know, don't we, from the book of Exodus and from the book of Psalms that Moses wrote songs. So perhaps he just thought that a song would be fitting at this point in the creation account. But it's at least possible that C.S. Lewis was right all along, and that the singing Aslan in The Magician's Nephew does actually reflect Genesis 1 after all. It's at least possible that this lyrical stanza in verse 27 with its 3 lines and its 3 occurrences of the verb created was sung by the 3 persons of the Trinity, expressing together in choral fashion their exhilaration here, their irrepressible joy. And we must ask why? Why such rapture? What is it about this creature man that so delights the triune creator? Well, 3 things. First of all, the similarity. The similarity. Let us make man in our image, after our likeness. Let those words sink in. I mean, what an achievement this is on God's part. Think for a moment of a roast dinner. A plate full of lovely, tender beef, accompanied by crispy roast potatoes and bulbous Yorkshire puddings and rich gravy and all the rest of it. And it's colourful and the smell is amazing, and more than anything, the taste is absolutely heavenly. But now imagine that a scientist invents a pill. And this pill, the scientist claims, is that roast dinner only in pill form. Take the pill, the scientist says, and you'll be enjoying a roast dinner. We'd be skeptical about that, wouldn't we? Because you just cannot capture that delectable roast dinner in a little white pill. Now think of God. And God is this infinite, boundless, uncontainable being. And here, on the other hand, is titchy little man. And man, God is saying here, man is that infinite, boundless, uncontainable being in creature form. It seems ridiculous, doesn't it? A pill just doesn't have the capacity to capture and resemble a roast dinner. And far less, surely, does a creature have the capacity to capture and resemble God. The gulf is just too huge. And yet this creature does capture and resemble God. There's a genuine similarity. God himself here says so. That is to say, man is the authorized image of God. You think of a petrol station, and there's a coffee machine inside the petrol station. I mean, one of those fancy big coffee machines that's been supplied by Costa Coffee. And so on the huge roadside sign outside the petrol station, as well as the official Esso logo or Shell logo or whatever, there'll be beneath that the official Costa logo, Costa Express, it will say. And that then is Costa authorizing the coffee in that petrol station. This isn't just the owner of the petrol station claiming that his coffee is as good as Costa's is. No, this is Costa Coffee confirming that the coffee is Costa Coffee quality. And throughout history then, many people and nations and civilizations have come up with statues, and they've come up with sculptures claiming that this golden cow or this bronze eagle, it's the image of God. So bow down and worship it. But they're all bogus claims. They're all fake claims, because there's only one authorized image of God, and that's man. What a creature man is. Does it not breathe more life into that command in 1 Peter 2:17 that we encountered a few weeks ago? Honor everyone, Peter says. And we said that's not even the heart of that text. Yes, there are higher things in that text, but honor everyone. No wonder we're supposed to honor everyone if everyone is the authorized image of God. Do you need to repent, perhaps, when you go home tonight? Because there's someone that you're not honoring. Someone at work, someone in your street, someone somewhere. And you're treating that person with dishonor, and yet we are encountering this truth in Scripture tonight that that person has a resemblance to God himself. That person is God in creature form. What a thought that is. Honor everyone. There's no one you will meet this week. There's no one with whom you will have any interactions this week who is not the image of God. The person who cuts in front of you as you're driving along, that person is the image of God. The person whose dog fouls in your front garden, that person is the image of God. What a thought. Honor everyone. Why such rapture in the heart of God? The similarity. Secondly, the suitability. The suitability. Imagine someone founds an orphanage, and over decades then, this orphanage is built up, and this founder of the orphanage has such a heart for all the children in it. But then the time comes for him to retire from that role. And this founder of the orphanage, then, he wants to find someone ever so suitable to take on the role of looking after these precious, precious children that mean so much to him. He has such a concern that the right person be found. And God, then, on day 5, has made all these fish and all these birds. And now, in the start of day 6, he has made all these animals. And they matter to him. They matter to him. Do you realize that? Perhaps you thought that it was a bit silly this evening, singing Psalm 104 all about the animals. We shouldn't be singing about animals. We should be singing about predestination and about the cross and about justification by faith. Why are we singing about donkeys and about Leviathan? Who cares about animals? Well, God does. They're his creatures. He made them. And at the end of creation week, then, he isn't retiring like the founder of the orphanage in my illustration, but he does want to delegate the stewardship of his creation to someone. And he can't delegate it to the fish. Salmon and lobsters, they're not suitable to take charge of everything. He can't delegate it to the birds. Starlings and pigeons, they're not suitable to take charge of the whole thing. He can't delegate it to the animals. Sheep and gerbils, they're not suitable to take charge of creation. So what does he do? Well, now, with the creation of man, there's someone who is suitable. Let us make man, he says, in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over the livestock, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. There's a telling couple of words in verse 28. Compare the first part of verse 28 with the first part of 22. And you look at verse 22, God blessed them, saying, be fruitful and multiply. And you look at verse 28, God blessed them, and God said to them, be fruitful and multiply. They're identical, aren't they? Well, no, they're not quite identical, are they? You notice there's 2 additional words in verse 28, and God said to them. To them. That's not there in verse 22 when God is addressing the fish and the birds, but it's there in verse 28 as God creates man. God said to them, be fruitful and multiply. Imagine as a bee finds its way into your kitchen, and you manage then, using a jar and a sheet of paper, to capture the bee inside the jar. And having captured it inside the jar, you carefully walk to the back door, you open the back door, and you toss the bee out of the jar. And as you do so, you say, out you go. And you're speaking to the bee, I suppose. Out you go. But you're not really speaking to the bee, are you? I mean, the bee is going out there no matter what. You're making sure of that by your vigorous shaking of the jar. It doesn't have any choice in the matter whatsoever. It's different, isn't it, when you want your young child who has been cooped up indoors for some time, and you want him to go out into the back garden and get some fresh air, and you open the back door and you use those same words, out you go. But you really are speaking to the child. You're addressing the child there as a genuine agent who can understand what you're saying and can respond to what you're saying. Now, when God says in verse 22, be fruitful and multiply, he's speaking there to the fish and the birds, but he's not really speaking to the fish and the birds. I mean, they are going to be fruitful and multiply no matter what. God is going, as we said last week, he's going to put those appetites and those urges inside the fish and the birds so that they will multiply and be fruitful. They have no choice in the matter. God is not really speaking, even though it appears that he is. He's not really speaking to the fish and the birds there in verse 22. But when God says in verse 28, be fruitful and multiply, he's really speaking to his human creatures. And that's why there's the addition of those two words. God said, to them, be fruitful and multiply. He's addressing his human creatures as genuine agents who can understand what he's saying and who can respond to what he's saying, because you see, here at last is a creature with which God can properly communicate. He can have no meaningful interaction with jellyfish or with magpies or with kangaroos, but he can have meaningful interaction with this creature that he's now come up with Adam and with Eve. And thus then, man is a suitable ruler, into whose hands God can safely entrust this creation that matters to him so much, and all the animals and all the fish and all the birds. They matter to him, and he wants someone who is qualified, who is fit, who is suitable to rule over the creation. And finally, in this being with whom he can even communicate, he finds someone suitable. The similarity, the suitability, and then one more reason for the rapture in God's heart: the sexes. The sexes. It's so interesting, isn't it, that the division of human beings into male and female is one of the things sung about in verse 27. It's presented there as something fantastic to be celebrated. You see, it's the last and the climactic decisive distinguishing, as I'm going to call it. There have been decisive distinguishings going on all the way through creation week, haven't there? Day and night, waters below and waters above, earth and seas. And in each case then, the distinguishing of the two things is unquestionably a good thing. It's the gradual remedying of that formlessness that's mentioned in verse 2. Everything was initially formless. You know what it's like when things have gone to pot somewhat with your cutlery drawer in the kitchen. And the knives and the forks and the dessert spoons and the teaspoons, they're all supposed to have their separate compartments, but you open the drawer and someone's been messing around and they're just all everywhere, they're all interspersed and mixed up with each other. And a kitchen cutlery drawer, then it needs order and it needs separation. And so does a planet. A planet needs order and it needs separation. And throughout then this week, God has been doing this good thing, this wonderful thing, this beautifying thing, and separating things so that day and night are distinct, and earth and seas are distinct, and the waters above and the waters below are distinct. I watched a documentary the other day on BBC Alba. On BBC Alba, you can't understand what anyone's saying, but fortunately there are subtitles for the Gaelic for English viewers. And it was about a tragedy which hit the Hebridean island of South Uist in 2005, 20 years ago. There was a very violent storm one night, and there was this family on the island of South Uist, and they were worried that their house wasn't going to withstand the night and the violence of the storm. And so they got into their car in order to drive somewhere more secure. And as they were driving along a road by the sea, the waves surged over the road and swept the car away, and this family were drowned. If they'd remained in the house, they would have been all right, but they drowned because of this wave sweeping across the road. And that night then, on South Uist, the sea crossed its boundary. Remember, we sang this morning in the first part of Psalm 104 about God setting up boundaries between the sea and the land. And of course, that's there in creation week. That night, the sea crossed its boundary and it merged with the land. And that wasn't a good thing. That was a tragic and a terrible thing. You think of what we call Thunder Thursday. Do you remember that? Back in 2012 here in Newcastle, the day that there was that iconic image taken of a streak of lightning hitting the Tyne Bridge. And I don't think I've ever seen such a storm as that one. And certainly I've never seen it go so dark in the middle of the day. This was June. We were approaching the longest day of the year, and yet In the early afternoon, in our street in Westmore, the street lights came on. It was almost as though then the night crossed its boundary and kind of merged with the day. And again, that wasn't good. That wasn't good. These boundaries, these distinctions between complementary opposites, they are healthy and they are necessary and they are beautiful. And as I say then, the climactic one in Creation Week is this one, the distinction between men and women, between male and female. It's the only one that's celebrated about in a song. The others are all great, the others are all good, but this one is so great and so good, it even makes it into this little song. Hardly anything about human beings makes it into this song. The fact that we're created, the fact that we're in the image of God, and then one other fact, that we are male and we are female. It's such a beautiful and important distinction that it makes it into the song. We live in a culture where people push back against this, don't we? And think that there's something artificial about it and something repressive about it. And we need to throw off this straitjacket of the two sexes. And that's called the progressive route. It's not progressive, it's deeply regressive. It's actually regressing back to pre-day one of Creation Week. It's regressing back to that formless, sloppy mess that the creation originally was, before the Spirit of God began his work of ordering and separating everything. There's nothing progressive about collapsing the sexes. The distinction is a beautiful and glorious thing. And so, for those three reasons then at least, as God creates man, his heart is full of rapture. Because of the similarity, man is a miniature replica of himself. Because of the suitability, here is a creature who can rule over everything. And because of the sexes, this beautiful distinction between man and woman. Resourceful speech, rapturous speech, and then thirdly and finally, revealing speech. Revealing speech. I'm thinking here of verse 28 then, where God speaks again, and we've already touched on things that he says here. But when I refer then to revealing speech, there's one word in particular that I'm thinking of, and it's that word subdue. Subdue. What does that word reveal? When God says here, be fruitful, multiply, and fill the earth, and subdue it. Well, it reveals that this rule, this dominion that God was giving man over the rest of the creation, it wasn't intended to be a kind of static and indefinite and open-ended thing. Rather, this rule, it has a goal that it's intending to reach. And that goal then is the earth, the whole earth, being subdued. That is, Adam and his descendants with him, they are to reach the point where every inch of it, every inch of this planet will be under their wise and gentle and liberating control. That's the goal. There's a goal in view as God gives Adam and his descendants dominion, and that goal is the subduing of the whole thing. And once they've reached that point then, Adam, with his descendants, he will be able to say to God, here you are, God. I've done it. I've completed this task that you gave me. I've fulfilled this mission that you entrusted to me. Here's your kingdom that you put under my feet. Here it is. It's all subdued now. It's all shipshape now. It's all in good order now. And I'm handing it to you for your glory. And what a day that will be then when Adam does that. What pleasure will light up the face of God as his king, Adam, hands a fully subdued world to him. Even more pleasure perhaps than on that day when he created him that we've been talking about. What a wonderful day that will be when Adam can present a fully subdued kingdom to God. Except, of course, the tragedy is it doesn't happen. Because Adam, well, we know what Adam does in chapter 3. And so Adam never reaches that intended goal. And there'll never be then that wonderful, magnificent, epic day when Adam hands over the kingdom fully under his rule to God. And there'll never be that pleasure beaming from the face of God as Adam does that. Or will there? I think there's something about the Bible storyline that you and I can often miss. And I'm going to illustrate this in a way that I did when preaching on 1 Corinthians 15 a few years ago. But when Hannah and I lived in Falkirk many years ago, we were going to a wedding one day in Solihull in the Midlands. And I think it was on the Friday night that we set off to drive down there. And we broke down on the M74, somewhere between Glasgow and Carlisle. We broke down, fortunately, just near a service station. And we had breakdown cover, so we phoned the breakdown people and they came out. But the deal was, and I suppose reasonably so, given how far away still we were from our destination, the deal was that they would take us back. And so they took us back to Falkirk. And we were glad to be rescued. We were glad to be away from that service station on the M74. But we were now back at square one. We were now back where we'd begun. We were a long way from this wedding in Solihull. And I think in many people's minds, God sends Jesus into this world in order to kind of take us back to the Garden of Eden and take us back into that situation that was lost when Adam sinned and take us back to that paradise there. But that's not the case. It's far better than that. God sends Jesus into this world to be another Adam. That's the language that's used, isn't it? In 1 Corinthians 15, he's the last Adam. And he sends Jesus into the world then, not simply to take us back to Falkirk, but to take us on to Solihull. That is, to take us to where the first Adam was supposed to take us all along. He was supposed to get to that point where everything would be subdued and under his rule, and he never got there. And Jesus comes and he steps into Adam's boots, and Jesus gets things to that point that Adam never made. And we read about that point there in 1 Corinthians 15. What a superb vision we're given there in 1 Corinthians 15 of the end. And do you remember how we're told there that in verse 24 of 1 Corinthians 15 at the end, Jesus, as this last Adam, he's going to deliver or hand over literally the kingdom to God the Father after he has destroyed every rule and every authority and every power. After he has brought everything under his dominion and he subdued everything. And of course, it's much harder for him to subdue everything than it would have been for the first Adam, because the first Adam didn't have to subdue death because there was no death. He didn't have to subdue demons because there were no demons active. But this Adam, he has to subdue all that kind of stuff under his feet. And the day is coming when he will have done that, and he will hand over the kingdom. And the day that Adam should have brought about will be brought about by this new Adam, Jesus Christ. And what a prospect that is then. We ended last week looking forward to the end, and I want to close tonight again looking forward to the end. There is a great day of presentation coming up when the last Adam, on behalf of us, all his people, will say, Father, I've done it. I've done it. I've brought everything under my control. Here's your kingdom. And there will be this smile across the face of the Heavenly Father as Jesus hands over the kingdom to him. And we'll be part of that if we're in Christ. And we'll be there. You're looking forward to this grand culmination of history. And if you're not going to be part of it, come tonight and trust in Jesus Christ and be part of this marvelous, marvelous climax that history is one day going to reach. May God bless his word. Amen.